Good night. Today, our group, formed by Andrès Restrepo, Jhoan Paruma, and myself, Nicolás Cadena, are going to talk about bilingual education. What is, its characteristics, the advantages and disadvantages, the actor who talks about the information that you are seeing in the video, and finally, some conclusions about the topic. To begin with, what is bilingual education? We have to do a distinction between two meanings. The first one explains how education tries to achieve in the student the capacity to understand, to talk, to write, to speak, and produce in both language that we are seeing in the classroom. The second one tries to achieve a full development of a language, but seeing the language as a monolingual who is going to be learned in the classroom. Both of those meanings can be taken if we have in consideration the type of bilingual education that must be watched, because there are some differences. But to have it clear, what can we understand as a bilingual person? There are a lot of definitions. Multiple authors have explained what it is. But we are going to take the definition of Johansen, who tells us that a bilingual subject is a person that is able to speak and communicate in two different languages. As an example, imagine a person who is from Colombia. He was born in Colombia, so his native language is Spanish. But he can easily speak to his friends of United States or England because he knows the language. Taking into consideration the definition of Johansen, the persona of the example is a bilingual person because he speaks two languages, the Spanish from this context and the English because of his friends. These educations provides with some limitations, which are models suggest static systems, variation in each model, are rarely addresses to the classroom process. Success or failure, the effectiveness are not explained in the models. Models are theoretical and completely practical. Models are often relevant to one context. And most of the contents in the models are derived from another hemisphere, who provides that models or countries from other hemispheres cannot be as equal as the model. The bilingual education have to be obtained certain process in which both languages are implied. As is seen in the screen, the first process talks about the process of the language sharing the communicative aspect. In this section, we can see that the language are used as a form of communication in which exists a code switching. What is to create a special effect to use both languages, or mixed language, which is a mixing of mostly words, phrases, clauses, or completely sentences that are mixed with two language varieties, or mixed language who normally are used on an intentional way. The second process talks about the process of the cultures add to the language. This cultural expression and interchange creates the motivation and clues to understand the language and speak it with more ease. Later on, we have the type of bilingual educations. There are transitional bilingual education, maintenance bilingual educations who are divided in static maintenance and development maintenance, enrichment bilingual education, submersion education, mainstreaming with pull-out classes, segregationist education. Some of them are going to be explained and reviewed next in the video. But let's talk about the main author.
Colin Baker was born in 1949, and he is best known for his works A Parent and a Teacher's Guide to Bilingualism, Attitudes and Languages, and Key Issues in Bilingualism and Bilingual Education. Colin Baker, who along with Edwards and Ferguson gave us some valuable contributions in the seek of a better understanding of bilingualism forms. They suggested 10 examples of the varying aims of bilingual education, which are the following. Number 1. To assimilate individuals or groups into the mainstream of society. To socialize people for full participation in the community. Number 2. To unify a multilingual society. To bring unity to a multi-ethnic, multi-tribal, multinational, linguistically diverse state. Number 3. To enable people to communicate with the outside world. Number 4. To provide language skills which are marketable, aiding employment and status. Number 5. To preserve ethnic and religious identity. Number 6. To reconcile and mediate between different linguistic and political communities. Number 7. To spread the use of colonial language, socializing an entire population to a colonial existence. Number 8. To strengthen the elite groups and preserve their privileged position in society. Number 9. To give equal status in law on languages of unequal status in daily life. Number 10. To deepen an understanding of language and culture. The paper mentions the mainstream of submersion education. The submersion students are thrown into a classroom and are supposed to learn through empiric interactions. Furthermore, in this type of education, the home language is not commonly used, and both students and the teacher are expected to communicate only using the majority language of the specific classroom. For example, let's imagine a Mexican kid who has been thrown into a new classroom with other kids that have English as an L1. Will he really learn? Besides, there are programs of structured immersion directed to minority language speakers. Initially, contributions made in the children's home language are okay and acceptable. The mainstream education is typically ESL, English as a second language. It aims to develop English language skills such as grammar, vocabulary, and communication because of the same curriculum they have. Content-based ESL in which students explore different parts of the curriculum through English. Language is simplified to communicate easier and make it comprehensible. Some of these simplifications are visual aids, gestures, or even mime. Maybe it can be too much if a student has to focus in his curriculum and also has to worry about language. It is very likely that the student will present problems related to time, stress, or even lack of self-confidence. The segregationist education occurs where minority language speakers are denied to go to the same programs or schools that majority language speakers attend. This is saw as a language power issue because of the ruling elite that suggests this type of education or segregation. The traditional bilingual education can be divided in two types: early exit and late exit. The early exit one proposes that students have a maximum of 2 years of support by using their mother tongue, while the late exit allows around 40% of language teaching in the mother tongue until 6th grade. It takes too much time, and because of that, other aspects as the curriculum and the academic content may be weakened. Now we are going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages we believe the bilingual education has.
Okay, now when it comes to advantages and disadvantages, we have got 2 and 4 respectively. The first advantage is transitional bilingual education as a brief. It is taken in this way as students can use their language to communicate in the classroom to a certain extent, since this type of bilingual education is focused on the idea that the students get used to English. This is allowed until the teacher considers that the level of ability of the student in the language is enough to move to the most common type of bilingual education. Thus, a good way of thinking about this is temporary swim in one pool until the child is perceived as capable of moving to the mainstream pool. The second is that in theory it takes into account minorities. We identified this as an advantage because the test said that there are two types of this kind of education, which are early exit and late exit transitional bilingual education. They differ in terms of the time students stay in bilingual education. In early exit, they stayed maximum 2 years, and in late exit, they stay until 6th grade. However, this will be criticized in disadvantages. For being remedial, this compensatory and segregated is the first we found, and it is because it perpetuates the status quo by separating language minority students from the mainstream and thus reproducing differences in power and progress for those with lower class status. Also, a transitional bilingual education program needs so much time to teach English that the academic content and cognitive complexity of the remainder of the curriculum is weakened. The second disadvantage is that it requires a specific teacher to be well used, and this is because it requires a Spanish-speaking teacher who may be more sensitive and successful in teaching English to Spanish children than English-only teachers. And of course, this is not possible in every single school, since there is no guarantee that every school will hire a teacher with this characteristic. The third disadvantage we found is called power and prestige, and it is people with power and prestige, such as principals and assistant principals, are often English monolinguals. The people with the least power and status are cooks, lunch monitors, cleaners, and janitors, who, for example, speak a minority language such as Spanish. The language of formal announcements is English. The language used by those who serve may be Spanish. The language to learn is the language of power and prestige, and in contrast, the language to forget is the language of servitude, stigma, and shame. The last disadvantage is called limitations with many home languages, and it is not possible in places with many immigrant languages, because, for example, in a place like London, where there are over 300 immigrant languages, there is no way that transitional bilingual education would be implemented, because the teacher cannot be a monitor in every single language, since he or she is not an expert in every immigrant language.